The sun blazed over Rome, pouring its relentless light onto the towering walls of the Colosseum. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the thunder of 50,000 voices. The crowd swayed like a living sea, restless and eager, their cries rising into the sky like a storm. On the floor of the arena, the sand was already stained. Dark patches where others had fallen, where lives had been claimed for spectacle. A wooden gate groaned open, and the world seemed to hold its breath. From the shadows crept a lion, its mane burning gold in the afternoon sun. Each step was slow, deliberate, a predator savoring the moment. Across the arena stood its opponent, a trembling man, condemned, unarmored, clutching nothing more than a wooden stick. No shield, no armor, no chance. This was not combat. This was theater. The carefully staged cruelty of an empire that demanded blood to feed its hunger for power and spectacle. In the Colosseum, not all battles were fair, and some were never meant to be. Tonight, we journey into the heart of Rome's most merciless arena, to uncover the matches so cruel, so lopsided, that they were less about survival and more about humiliation. These were the most unfair fights ever fought in the Colosseum. If the truth hidden in these blood-soaked sands grips you already, join us here on Cursed Chronicles. Subscribe now and step deeper into history's most haunting spectacles, where every story leaves its mark and every shadow whispers of what humanity is capable of. The Colosseum rose like a crown of stone in the heart of Rome, a monument to power and spectacle. 50,000 men, women, and children could be packed within its towering walls, their voices merging into a deafening roar that shook the very ground. To the empire, it was more than just an arena. It was a symbol, a place where Rome displayed its wealth, its dominance, and its unyielding control over life and death. For centuries, storytellers and films have dressed these games in the garments of honor and valor. Gladiators locked in noble combat, warriors fighting for glory, men earning their freedom through skill and courage. But beneath that polished image lay something far darker. The truth was cruel, imbalanced, and meticulously staged. Many who stepped into that arena were never gladiators at all. They were criminals, prisoners of war, slaves, or simply victims chosen to amuse a restless crowd. The Colosseum did not exist to give men equal chances. It existed to remind them of their place. It existed to remind Rome's citizens of their empire's power, and its enemies of the cost of defiance. The games were not battles between equals. They were often orchestrated massacres, cleverly disguised as entertainment. And so, as the crowd thundered and the sands drank their fill, fairness was never the question. The match was never designed to be fair. It was designed to be unforgettable. Let us now step into the blood-stained truth, the matches where one side never stood a chance, and cruelty itself became the spectacle. If this glimpse into Rome's shadows unsettles you, there are far darker truths yet to be uncovered. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles, and together we'll walk deeper into the forgotten corners of history, where horror and humanity collide. They called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. To the Roman crowd, it was entertainment. To the condemned, it was terror wrapped in ceremony. Prisoners, rebels, and those deemed enemies of the state were led into the arena not as combatants, but as offerings. They carried no swords, no shields, often nothing at all. Some were given wooden branches, little more than toys, a cruel gesture mocking the idea of defense. Others were blindfolded, stumbling in the sand while the crowd roared with laughter, their fate sealed before the gate ever opened. From the shadows, predators emerged, lions, leopards, and bears brought from the farthest reaches of the empire. They were starved before the games, their hunger sharpened until their very presence was enough to freeze a man's blood. When they leapt, it was not a contest. It was slaughter, a body torn apart limb by limb as 50,000 voices howled approval from the stands. There was no mercy in this spectacle, no dignity in the deaths. Victims were sometimes tied to stakes, left helpless as animals circled and lunged. The men could not fight, could not flee. They could only scream or fall silent, swallowed by the dust and the sand. Rome called it justice. The crowd called it amusement. But in truth, it was humiliation given form, a theater of cruelty that reminded every eye in the stands of Rome's power over life itself. The sand beneath the Colosseum was said to drink so much blood that it never truly dried, its grains forever darkened by the endless cycle of violence. And in that sand lay the bones of thousands who had never been warriors, only condemned souls offered to beasts for the sake of spectacle. This was not sport. It was a ritual of dominance, a lesson that in Rome, death itself could be choreographed, and humanity could be stripped away as easily as a cloak. The crowd left satisfied, not because they had seen skill or bravery, but because they had witnessed the empire's mastery over both man and beast. If the cruelty of these games chills you, there are still darker truths buried in history's shadows. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles, and we will uncover them together, one story at a time. Not all blood spilled in the Colosseum came from animals unleashed upon the helpless. At times, the cruelty took a different form, one that wore the mask of combat, yet stripped away any notion of equality. Trained gladiators, men hardened by years of fighting, were ordered to face opponents who were never meant to survive. Their adversaries were not fellow warriors, but prisoners dragged from cells, slaves pulled from chains, and the condemned pushed into the sand with weapons so poorly made they broke upon first strike. The match would begin with ceremony, the crowd eager for spectacle. A man might lift a sword, its blade dulled, its weight unbalanced. His shield, if he had one at all, could splinter at the first blow. Across from him stood a gladiator whose body was carved with scars, whose arm knew the rhythm of steel, whose eyes had already measured the distance between life and death. There was no suspense in these encounters, only inevitability. The gladiator struck, and the other fell. The crowd cheered not at valor, but at execution disguised as contest. Sometimes cruelty was sharpened further. Prisoners were dressed as mythological villains, clothed in costumes meant to mock them before the kill. A condemned man might be cast as a legendary criminal, and when the gladiator cut him down, it was staged as a triumph of justice. Yet the truth was that Rome turned human suffering into theater, weaving humiliation into every act. The victims were never fighters. They were props, their deaths scripted before they stepped onto the blood-stained sand. The crowd adored it. They laughed when a shield shattered, when a prisoner stumbled under the weight of armor too large, when a weapon bent like a reed. They came not for suspense, but for certainty. The certainty of domination, of Rome's power displayed in human form. And for the gladiator there was no choice. To refuse was to be branded disloyal. To fight was to obey the empire's will, even when his opponent was little more than a lamb led to slaughter. This was not the honor that stories speak of, not the noble duels painted by later imagination. It was cruelty systematized, wrapped in ritual, served to an audience that demanded blood as eagerly as bread. In these matches there was no glory, only the silence that followed after a man's last breath, and the roar of a crowd who had seen justice, spectacle, and power, all at once. If these staged massacres unsettle you, know that the shadows of the Colosseum still hold stories more disturbing than this. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles, and together we'll continue unearthing the truths that history tried to bury. The cruelty of the Colosseum did not always pit man against beast, nor gladiator against prisoner. Sometimes the victims were creatures themselves, animals dragged from distant lands, forced into combat they neither understood nor sought. These were not natural hunts, but spectacles of strangeness, where exotic met exotic, and the crowd reveled in the clash. Elephants from Africa were herded into the arena, their massive forms trembling under the jeers of the spectators. Opposite them, bulls were released, their horns sharpened for violence. The animals collided in confusion, not hatred, driven by hunger, pain, and fear. Lions were thrown against bears, leopards against ostriches, wolves against wild boars. The matches had no sense, no balance, only novelty. To the crowd, it was the thrill of watching nature itself distorted, chaos unfolding for their amusement. The animals had been transported across deserts and seas, stolen from their homes, weakened by chains and cages. Many were starved before release, goaded with fire, or wounded to enrage them. Their battles were not fought from instinct, but forced through cruelty. When the gate opened, the Colosseum became a theater of madness. Creatures bewildered, thrashing, clawing, bleeding, until one collapsed and the sand drank its blood. To the Romans, this was proof of empire. These beasts, gathered from lands conquered or subdued, symbolized the reach of Roman power. A lion from Africa, a bear from the northern forests, an elephant from the east, all thrown together to die for the empire's pleasure. Each contest was not merely spectacle, but a statement that Rome ruled not only men, but the very creatures of the earth. The crowd marveled at the sight of animals they would never see in their lives outside this theater. Mixed with cruelty, children pointed, nobles laughed, emperors smiled at the sheer waste. Death was the price of wonder, and the wonder was fleeting. When one beast finally fell, the crowd demanded more, always more. There was no fairness here, no glory, no story of survival. Only the grotesque spectacle of nature turned into parody, of life reduced to performance. And when the bodies were dragged away, when the blood was covered with fresh sand, the Colosseum stood ready for the next horror, as if nothing had happened at all. If this glimpse of nature's suffering in Rome's grand theater unsettles you, know this: far darker spectacles still await. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles, and step with us deeper into the shadows, where cruelty was not an exception, but the rule. There were days when the Colosseum floor became a graveyard for dozens, even hundreds, in a single breath. Not the slow death of duels, not the isolated spectacle of man against beast, but orchestrated slaughter. Entire groups of the powerless thrown into the arena together, their deaths scripted as theater. Slaves captured in war were the most common victims. Stripped of their names, their families, and their freedom, they were herded into the sands with little more than crude weapons, if any at all. Opposite them stood trained gladiators, armored and armed, their bodies disciplined for combat. The outcome was never in doubt. What followed was not battle, but massacre. One by one the captives fell, their cries swallowed by the roar of the crowd. Rome called it a lesson to its enemies. The audience called it entertainment. Sometimes these killings took the form of reenactments. Entire groups of prisoners were dressed as defeated soldiers from conquered lands, their humiliation dragged further by costumes mocking their heritage. They were ordered to fight against overwhelming odds, their roles predetermined. They would fall as their people had fallen, their deaths played out on the sand for Rome's amusement. The Colosseum was not only a stage for cruelty, but a stage for empire's propaganda. The audience cheered not at fairness, but at power displayed and reinforced. During the reign of Emperor Trajan, the bloodletting reached unprecedented heights. To celebrate his victories, he ordered games that lasted for months, during which thousands of people were slaughtered. Captives from his campaigns were paraded into the arena in waves, butchered to remind the city of the emperor's triumphs. The people cheered as though they themselves had conquered, never questioning the price in human lives. For those condemned, there was no dignity in dying here. They did not meet their end as warriors, but as shadows, nameless, faceless victims swallowed by the sands. Their bodies were removed swiftly, the ground raked and covered with fresh sand so the next act could begin, as if the lives taken moments earlier had meant nothing at all. What remains chilling is not only the scale of the bloodshed, but the ease with which it was consumed. Families sat in the stands together, eating and drinking while men and women were cut down below. Children laughed as captives fell, nobles debated the skill of the gladiators, emperors waved their approval. For Rome, these massacres were not tragedy, but spectacle. Another reminder that, in this empire, death itself belonged to the crowd. If this descent into mass slaughter stirs unease, stay with Cursed Chronicles. Subscribe now, and uncover the hidden truths of history's darkest theaters, where the cruelty of power was written in blood and sand. The Colosseum was more than a place of entertainment. It was a stage where emperors wrote their power into flesh and blood. Every unfair match, every staged execution, every grotesque spectacle carried a message. And that message was clear. Rome was supreme, and defiance would be crushed without mercy. When rebels were captured, Their fate was not quiet execution in the shadows. Instead, they were paraded into the arena before tens of thousands, their deaths transformed into a public warning. Armed with nothing, sometimes even chained together, they faced gladiators or beasts under the gaze of an emperor who sat in judgment. Each fall, each scream, was meant to remind the people what rebellion would bring. Not only death, but humiliation in front of an empire's eyes. Christians, too, became victims of this political theater. To the rulers of Rome, their refusal to worship the gods was not just defiance of faith, but defiance of the state itself. Many were condemned to the beasts, their suffering displayed to prove that Rome's will was unshakable. For the crowd, it was a spectacle. For the empire, it was propaganda carved into the sands with blood. The Colosseum became a pulpit of power, where the gospel of Rome's dominance was preached through cruelty. Even myth was used to drive home the empire's control. Condemned men were dressed as villains from legend. Prometheus chained to a rock, Orpheus surrounded by animals, Icarus mocked for his fall. Their deaths became twisted reenactments, staged morality plays where Rome decided the ending. To the audience, it was entertainment wrapped in familiar stories. To the condemned, it was erasure. Their identity stripped, their humanity reduced to a symbol, their final moments serving nothing but spectacle and state. In this way, the Colosseum was not only a theater of blood but a theater of messages. Every unfair match, every hopeless fight, every rigged execution was a reminder that the empire controlled not only life and death, but the very narrative of history itself. The sand was Rome's parchment, and it was written in human lives. If these dark performances of power make you wonder what else the empire hid in shadows, subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. With each story, we tear back the veil on history's cruelest truths and show the world that power is never without a cost. The roar of the crowd was not just noise. It was the heartbeat of the Colosseum. 50,000 voices rising in unison, demanding blood, demanding spectacle. To understand the unfair matches of Rome, one must understand the minds that craved them. For the cruelty was not hidden, it was celebrated. The unfairness was not shameful, it was the point. In the stands sat senators and slaves, nobles and commoners alike. The arena leveled them not in dignity, but in appetite. Here, all were united in their hunger for domination. The sight of a man torn by beasts or a prisoner cut down by a trained gladiator was not tragedy to them, but reassurance. It reminded the citizen that Rome was strong, that rebellion was useless, that power flowed in one direction only. To cheer for the blood was to cheer for Rome itself. Psychologists of another age might call it desensitization, or bloodlust, or the intoxication of spectacle. But to the Romans it was identity. Their empire had conquered lands, enslaved nations, and brought the most exotic creatures into its grip. To watch those conquered bodies, human and animal alike, die in the Colosseum was to taste empire, to drink from its cup of supremacy. Yet not all were blind to the horror. Seneca, the philosopher, once wrote of the games with disgust, describing the slaughter as pure butchery, devoid of skill or meaning. Others whispered unease at how quickly the crowd laughed as men begged for their lives. But those voices were few, drowned beneath the thunder of approval. Rome was not built on pity. It was built on power, and the Colosseum was its mirror. And so, the psychology of the crowd was simple. Cruelty was not a flaw of the games, but their essence. The unfairness thrilled them, because it reminded each spectator that they were on the safe side of the wall. They were not the ones in chains. They were not the ones staring into the eyes of a lion. To watch others suffer was to feel secure in their own place, a fleeting comfort bought with blood. This is the haunting legacy of the Colosseum. Not only the bodies left broken in the sand, but the hearts hardened in the stands. It was not only the victims who were scarred, but the society that made cruelty its favorite spectacle. If these dark truths about human nature disturb you, remember there are more shadows yet to explore. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles, and together we'll unravel the psychology of cruelty through history's darkest ages. The Colosseum still stands today, its arches weathered, its stones scarred, a silent monument to both grandeur and cruelty. Tourists walk its corridors, their footsteps echoing where the condemned once trembled. The arena lies open beneath the sky, its sands long swept clean, but the memory lingers. It is a place where fairness was never the measure, where spectacle mattered more than justice, where death was not hidden but displayed, rehearsed, and applauded. The unfair matches that unfolded there were not accidents of circumstance, they were deliberate designs. A man against a lion with only a stick, a prisoner against a seasoned gladiator with a broken blade, a slave against an army of soldiers, doomed before he lifted his hand. These were not contests but lessons written in blood. Lessons for rebels, lessons for captives, lessons for citizens who needed to be reminded of who ruled them, and who could take their lives with a wave of the emperor's hand. But beyond the politics, beyond the cruelty, lies the deepest truth. The Colosseum revealed the darkest hunger of humanity itself. The crowd did not turn away from the helpless. They demanded it. They wanted to see the scales tipped, the weak devoured, the doomed humiliated. Their cheers did not rise for courage but for certainty, for the assurance that Rome was untouchable, and that its power would always be written in someone else's suffering. And yet, within that haunting truth lies reflection. The Colosseum is a ruin now, its seats empty, its roar silenced. But the echoes of those unfair matches remind us of what happens when cruelty becomes entertainment, when power turns death into spectacle, when fairness is abandoned in favor of control. It is a mirror, cracked but unbroken, reflecting not only Rome's past, but the shadows that still linger in us all. The most unfair matches ever fought in the Colosseum were not simply executions. They were symbols, symbols of dominance, of humiliation, of the fragility of life beneath empire's gaze. And though the arena has fallen silent, those symbols still speak, whispering through the stone. That once, in Rome, human life was reduced to dust for nothing more than the crowd's applause. If this journey into Rome's darkest arena has left its mark on you, step with us further into history's shadows. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles, where the past is never buried, and the stories of cruelty, power, and survival continue to rise from the dust.